Okay, welcome APUSH students to Chapter 3. This is the British Atlantic World from 1660 to 1750. Basically, we're really going to give you a brief overview of the colonies themselves, the English colonies, and a little bit of an insight into the practice of slavery that develops within this time period. Okay, so the Restoration colonies and imperial expansion. As I've said, we had several different types of English colonies. Proprietorship was a royal grant of land given to individuals by the English crown. Basically, you could do whatever you wanted with it. It could be a religious refuge. It could be strictly for money, an economic venture, if you wanted, as long as it lay within English laws. You couldn't be doing things that the English government didn't accept. The Carolinas, in particular, South Carolina established a strict racial hierarchy, and their cash crop that they really focused on in South Carolina was rice. And rice is it's a pretty intensive endeavor, and treatment of slaves here is pretty bad because it's a tough crop to grow. We have William Penn, and what you're going to see really some comparisons here. When you look at the Carolinas, this is really as close as America will ever get to anything that they had in Europe, as far as an aristocracy with nobles, with peasants working the fields. This is as close as we'll get here in America. Now, William Penn in Pennsylvania, these were different people. They're Quakers, and William Penn had been given Pennsylvania as a payment for a debt that the king had owed his father. And so the Quakers were not, they weren't really accepted in England anyway. So this gave them a new chance to worship in peace, as they saw it, without being persecuted by other Englishmen. They're going to have their own colony all to themselves, and they did it a lot better and a lot different than the other colonies. Even before they ever arrived in the colony, they had drafted a letter for the Delaware Indians telling them that they weren't like the normal Englishmen, that they were peaceful, and that they wanted to embark in trade with them. And so they really, for a long time, had a good relationship with the Indians. They actually paid Native Americans for their land. They didn't cheat them. They considered themselves, as many religious groups did, as a holy experiment. They had toleration of many religious groups, basically practicing religious tolerance in their colony, which in the end kind of ended up biting them once Quakers got outnumbered in Pennsylvania. Things began to shift. In their beliefs, all could attain salvation. This wasn't the Puritans, where some of you were damned to hell at the beginning of time, thanks to predestination. It wasn't extremely hard to make it to be accepted into their church like it was with the Puritans. Women had many rights in the church. They could actually become preachers and speak publicly, which of course made them seem very radical to the other religious groups in the colonies and in England itself. Economically speaking, or I guess still politically, I guess, but there's going to be a slight shift here from mercantilism, basically to the crown dominating the colonies. In the beginning, the colonies were basically economically running themselves, but that meant that they might be buying goods from the Dutch or buying goods from, even worse, the French. And the English decided they weren't going to have that. So this brought about the Navigation Acts, which are very important test questions for sure, AP exam. Laws passed by England that required all goods to be carried on English or colonial ships. The colonists could not trade with other countries. The colonists don't take too well to this, and so they begin smuggling. And not many, but several of our founding fathers were actually smugglers. John Hancock himself was a big-time smuggler. And they're doing their best to get around what they see as an unjust law, because they could get French molasses for cheaper than English molasses. They should be able to buy the cheaper molasses and not be controlled by their government 3,000 miles away. The Dominion of New England, very important as well, which combined Massachusetts, the hotbed of the Puritans, of course, with the rest of the New England colonies. And later on, New Jersey and New York are put in there. And really what's significant about this is that the assemblies, this kind of small-scale democratic stuff where you have assemblies voting on items, were eliminated. And this new governor, Sir Edmund Andros, is appointed, and he's a military dictator. That's exactly what he is. They revoke Massachusetts charter. They opened Massachusetts to other religions, whereas the Puritans had been exclusive. So they certainly didn't like that. Remember, Massachusetts was a theocracy. The religion ruled the day. And now here England comes in and asserting their will takes them over and takes away what makes them them. The Dominion was met with resistance. It ended with the Glorious Revolution in England when when new monarchs take the throne. Okay, James II is overthrown. William and Mary are installed as joint rulers, and James II was seen as being too Catholic, and so they threw him out. Declaration of Rights established a constitutional monarchy that limited the power of the monarchy. And while all of this is going on, you're going to start getting rebellions in America, such as Laszlo's rebellion. He rebels against the Dominion of New England. He's a very temperamental militiaman who got in arguments with some of the British ruling factors here. And for a good 2 years, he ruled the southern part of the Dominion of New England. But eventually he is captured. They hang him and decapitate him. It demonstrates tensions between the lower class and the wealthy. That's certainly a theme that will exist throughout American history and really history as a whole around the world. Imperial Wars and Native Peoples. You got tribalization here. Native Americans were forced to demands of Europeans. Remember, the Europeans are now coming in larger numbers. The one advantage Native Americans had for a while was their numbers, but that is beginning to, because of the disease, to change. And the fact that the English are coming in families. They are reproducing in large numbers. Interestingly enough, the average lifespan in Massachusetts was 10 years longer than that in England because of pollution and stuff from the smog from the factories. People were dying earlier in England and Europe at the time. So over here in America, they actually lived longer, which gave them a window, of course, to have more children. And so population is growing over here. Okay, the Iroquois Indians, again, they're still important. Not only were they a powerhouse, but they were really good at using the French and the English against each other. Very cunningly, they play these two powers off against each other so that they are the ones who get something out of it, the Indians are. They did their best to remain neutral in the conflicts between the two powers, but a war is brewing. It is coming. 1754, we will get a major war here in the North American continent. Okay, so let's shift gears just a little bit here to the imperial slave economy. We get something you have to know called the South Atlantic System. All this is trade between the Caribbean, Brazil, and Africa, going back and forth. England and the West Indies. Barbados, there in the Caribbean, became a major sugar producer using all this slave labor. And we talked about how horrendous the conditions of sugar slaves were. These men, and it is almost exclusively men, are dying typically by the age of 21, and they're just literally being worked to death. So what's the impact on Britain here? Well, England gained tremendous wealth through the South Atlantic System and the Navigation Acts. They're setting up a system that makes sure all the money comes to them. Yeah, sure, the colonists are benefiting. It isn't like they're not having good lives, but they're beginning to feel as though England is trying to keep them down. And that's important because eventually we slide down through time to 1776. So that's kind of the elephant in the room at this point, but we're not there yet. The colonists are still very, very British, and they certainly don't see themselves as anything unified together. Africans and slave trade. West Africa is the major area that slaves are coming from. 2 out of every 3 slaves were men. Remember, they're wanting hard physical labor out in the fields. That's what they're getting them for. The women themselves who become slaves they can work in the fields too, and some do. And others serve as nannies and clean, and they become domestic slaves in the easier life. But that could also, land you in the master's bed. Unfortunately, there were rapings and stuff of that nature going on. What's the effect back in Africa? Well, so many men have left that Africans begin practicing polygamy because there's just an imbalance of the genders. It isn't 50-50 anymore. It's, you have 2/3 of the men gone. So they adapt by practicing polygamy. Now, the Middle Passage, you should know, is that journey from Africa to the Americas. It's horrendous. They're chained together where they can't really move on this long journey for months across the Atlantic Ocean. They're using the bathroom on each other. When one gets sick, the others get sick. Something like 10% of them die on the way over. They would bring them up once a week to clean them, and when they could, if they got the chance, many of the slaves would jump into the ocean and drown themselves rather than continue in those horrific conditions. When they get here, of course, they're going to go to auction, and they're going to sell based on physical attributes and health and things like that. Bigger, stronger slaves sold for more because it's assumed they can do more work. They're going to work at least 10 hours a day in tropical heat. Just physical abuse by whippings and beatings, exploitation of sexual exploitation. These are all things that slaves suffered through. Now, what's slavery like in the Chesapeake and South Carolina? By 1740, slaves made up an incredible 40% of the population in Chesapeake. Almost half of the people there are slaves. And what causes that increase? 1776 is the end of Metacom's War. It's done with the idea of Indians really ever making good slaves. They just don't, because when they escape, they're not going to be found again. They die too easily because of disease. Slaves were defined by race at this time. Slave owners could not be charged with a crime if they killed their slaves. That's important because it essentially means that slaves aren't seen as human. And the slave owner could beat his slave to death and suffer no consequences. Slavery, of course, was more arduous in the Caribbean. We talked about that. And diseases were more frequent in the West Indies. More mosquitoes carrying bad diseases. South Carolina raised mostly rice. Again, conditions very similar to that of sugar. African community emerges. And listen, the owners they're clever. These white people, you will see the South they're not a bunch of dumb rednecks. They're very clever in their defense of slavery, and they're setting up the institution of slavery. They are going to purposely buy slaves from different areas of Africa, a continent that speaks 1,000 different languages, 1,000 different dialects. And so they keep it nice and mixed so that their slaves don't speak the same language. They assume that this will give them advantage over the slaves because communication is so important. Now, the slaves adapt by mixing, creating their own languages such as Gullah, and blend. And that Gullah is spelled Gulluh, and blending that with English. Remember, many of the Africans coming over are Muslims, but they're going to be converted eventually to Christianity here in the New World. So they developed a unique culture. It's a blend of their own stuff from back home, some new stuff they come up with, and American culture, or just say English culture, that they're exposed to. Slave resistance, for the most part, really takes, it really looks like this. They're going to accidentally break tools. They're going to work a little bit slower than they actually can, because that's really about all they can do. They don't have access to guns, and even in areas where they outnumber whites, the whites still have the guns, and you're talking about death. And when you did have these slave rebellions on the occasion, retribution was swift and terrible. If you kill a white person, you're probably going to lose 10 African Americans. You'll see that. So one rebellion was the Stono Rebellion. I always remember the Stono Rebellion by the S. Stono, South Carolina. Stono, South Carolina. So you had these slaves who revolted in South Carolina. They kill some whites. They're going to try to escape south to Spanish Florida. And the Stono Rebellion was provoked by the Spanish. They want to weaken the English system here in the South, and they see the slaves as a way to do that. So they're in their ears, sneaky, and telling them. They basically give them the idea that they will help them if they uprise, but they don't. Now, after this, here's very important: the effect, cause and effect situation here. Slave laws became much more strict. They're not going to allow blacks to congregate in large numbers. Anything over four or so, they're getting nervous because they think there's a rebellion coming. And again, they're going to kill quite a few slaves. You get the rise of the Southern gentry. This is the high social class, our version of aristocrats. Wealthy plantation owners, they had a tremendous power. And our definition of plantation owner is someone who owned 20 slaves or more. These were the rich. To own 20 slaves, you had to be rich. And some of the largest slave owners owned, several hundred. So they are the ultra rich, the George Washingtons and Thomas Jeffersons of the world. George Washington being the richest president in our history until Donald Trump. So they hope to prevent another Bacon's Rebellion by lowering taxes and encouraging small farmers to own slaves. They even give small farmers the right to vote. What they don't want is poor whites having common cause with slaves. That would be too much because poor whites can get access to guns and slaves have numbers. Together, they would have been very powerful. So the rich have to be careful here. So they're going to make poor farmers, they're going to basically create this image of, yeah, you may not have as much money as us, but you're not a slave. They're beneath you. They're below you. And you don't ever want to be like them. So take these crumbs we're giving you and enjoy them. Sort of what's going on here. Now, the North is very different, based off more of a maritime economy, meaning that the coastal trade, sea trade, and trade increased contact and reliance between New England and the West Indies. You get more of an urban economy there. These cities, of course, are very small, but they are growing. Molasses from the West Indies was turned into rum in New England, so that's an important trade item. The New England fishing industry sold fish to Europe, and fish make good money. That's a good trade. And a major shipbuilding industry also emerged in New England. 1/3 of the British fleet the wood came from New England. They had plenty of trees. And so cut them down and ship them to Britain, and they use them to make their awesome man of war ships. The British Navy, of course, being the greatest navy in the world. Now, merchant elites controlled a sizable portion of trade in New England, and that's very important because the American Revolution isn't a poor person revolution. It is a rich person revolution. The elites are the ones who revolt against British control. These merchant elites control a sizable portion. They're the ones that's going to be affected by the taxes that are coming. Artisans made up about 50% of society here. Artisans being skilled workers, glassmakers, silversmiths, people like that. Indentured servants and slaves worked on the docks. So in the beginning, and it's important to know, they do have some slaves, but it's one here, one there. They don't own them in large numbers, and their lives are not nearly as bad as what they are in the South. And as time goes on and the rift between the North and the South grows, the North will ban slavery. Children were often forced to work to help provide for their families, but that's no different than the Industrial Revolution that you learned about in world history. So you're getting a little bit of that here. From 1713 to 1750, you see a rise in colonial assemblies, but only white property-owning males could vote, but that's still more than it is in Britain. We cannot judge who could vote in this time period versus what it is today because there's no comparison. You have to compare it against the rest of the world at the time. And so for over here in the colonies to allow any white property owning male of age, 21, to vote was very democratic. Many assemblies limited the power of the royally appointed governor. That's very important. You have these royal governors who are overseeing the colonies in favor of Britain, but the colonists are writing the checks, not Britain. And so if you want to get paid, when the colonists have an idea or they do something that's maybe wrong, you look the other way because they're the ones signing your check, not the king. Very important. Now, elite families dominated politics, and many members of one family would serve on legislatures. So it was, as you're used to, power was concentrated in the hands of the wealthy. Crowds would often protest colonial acts that were deemed unpopular. So It's never like the masses are truly powerless. They're still able to protest and they're still able to lean. If it gets bad enough, they're still able to lean on the wealthy and can typically see better conditions because of that. Another important term, salutary neglect. This was coined by the philosopher Edmund Burke. Basically, this very easy to remember. Students don't struggle with this. It's a time period when England left the colonies alone. It's about 100 years. As long as the colonies were making money for them, they had other stuff to worry about over there in England with France and internal issues, and they kind of leave the colonists to their own ambitions. At probably a mistake because it's going to plant the seeds of self-rule in the colonies. And when England comes back later on and in salutary neglect and begins trying to assert themselves in the colonies are going to be very resentful of this. We're going to give an analogy of the colonies being a teenager and the British Empire being the adult. And we'll talk about that a little more in class and in later sections of notes. So salutary neglect ends in 1763 with the end of the 7 Years' War, which began in 1754. And Britain needs money to pay for its debt. And they're going to, and the colonists enjoyed low taxes, a fifth of the taxes that they paid in England. And England felt like it was time for the colonists to pay their share. And so they're going to start instituting taxes, and that's going to lead us down the road to revolution. Now, got to protect that mercantile system. Georgia was established as a buffer colony between South Carolina and the Spanish in Florida. It's really a penal colony, given control to George Oglethorpe, and a lot of convicts from England were settled there. And it's just to give them, they're not viewing it so much as being profitable. They just don't want Spain right next to the profitable South Carolina. So it's a buffer zone. So then you get here the War of Jenkins' Ear, which was fought over land disputes between the Spanish and the British. And you're going to get land disputes between the British and the French. You're going to see that. Now, American colonists began to control more and more of the Atlantic trade, and this began making very wealthy colonial men, what we would consider Americans, but they're not Americans yet. You got the Molasses Act in 1733, however, which placed a high tariff on French molasses. That's going to make some colonists mad, some traders, merchants. Although Britain discouraged trade with other countries, colonists routinely smuggled those goods. It's worth the risk. Smuggling brings great wealth to the people willing to do it. The Currency Act comes a little bit later, 1751. It was the first of two currency acts, and it prohibited the colonies from issuing paper money. Again, it's a matter of control. There for a while, the colonists were printing all their own money, which only worked in their colonies, and it was this and that. And the British said, no, that's not going to work. You can't issue your own money. The recap, just remember the religious aspects of Pennsylvania, the Quakers, the religious tolerance, the female equality there, but it will eventually go away as other people move in and begin to outnumber the Quakers. Navigation Acts, British attempt to limit colonial power and to limit the power of the people they're buying from. They're buying from the French. That's empowering the French. That goes against mercantilism. Transatlantic trade increased the demand for sugar and slaves. Huge number of slaves coming over to the New World. Vast majority going to the sugar colonies. Comparing slavery in Chesapeake with South Carolina and the West Indies, they're comparable because South Carolina's rice production is pretty brutal, but nothing's worse than the sugar slavery in the West Indies. The Stono Rebellion, Spain's attempt to give England grief. All it does is result, it's put down very harshly, and all it does is result in worse slave laws. Salutary neglect is England turning a blind eye to the colonies for almost 100 years, as long as they're making them money. And that plants the seeds of self-rule. And most conflicts between countries, of course, was over land, because land equals resources, resources equal money. And colonists avoided British acts, the Navigation Acts, by smuggling. All right, guys, that's it. And I hope you take good notes off of that. And American history is on its way to becoming more and more interesting.